There's an interesting comment in the States last week, actually, which can be reapplied here, that two people with knowledge of a situation can have a different opinion on the same facts. And that doesn't make either opinion invalid.
Welcome to the Bailiwick Express Podcast. My name is Matthew Leach. I'll be joined each week by a guest for a series of podcasts. Each will shine a light on topics from across the bailiwick. The format will change week to week. We'll have debates, reviews, hot seat interviews and special guests. So stick with us as we offer some insight on some of the most important issues we in the bailiwick face. It was a busy week for our Director of Public Health, Dr. Nicola Brink, and not for the reasons you'd expect. Her predecessor lodged a legal challenge against her after being made to self-isolate on his arrival into Guernsey from New Zealand. Dr. Stephen Bridgman ultimately lost his case, despite claiming that the deprivation of his liberty was unlawful. Bailiwick Express Editor Aaron Carpenter was there for the full court hearing and explains what happened, what we learned from this very important legal challenge, and what it means for the future of the island and the CCA. We are going to be talking today about Dr. Stephen, is it Bridgman or Brigman? Bridgman, who took the Director of Public Health and CCA to court. Give us a quick outline of, why?
Dr. Stephen Bridgman is by way of background, he is the former office holder of the position that is now held by Dr. Brink. She's obviously well known, especially in the last 18 months, as the Director of Public Health for the island. Before that, Dr. Stephen Bridgman filled an equivalent role, which is essentially the Medical Officer for Health in Guernsey between 2008 and 2017. Since he left the island, he's been living and working in New Zealand, visiting the island on his estimates 2 or 3 times a year to see family and friends over here. Recently, he'd been wanting to come back over to the island, and when he saw a press release, which was actually aimed at blue arrivals within the Common Travel Area, so for any uncertainty there, that's the UK, Ireland, Isle of Man, Jersey, and Guernsey. Apparently, he read that and mistakenly believed that also applied to him because he'd been fully vaccinated in New Zealand. During his travel, or after his daughter's travel over to the island, it became apparent that wouldn't be the case, that he was outside of the CTA and was not eligible for the restrictionless movement that those who are fully vaccinated for more than 2 weeks, are allowed under the current system within essentially the British Isles and Ireland. So there was an application during his transit at Singapore Airport for a variation, which essentially was something that he decided to do to enable him to still come over and not have to isolate. That was turned down because his reasons for it weren't considered to be good enough, essentially. It is that provision of a variation is there in certain, mainly for compassionate reasons. His reasons were simply that he had limited leave to travel as a critical worker in New Zealand, and advanced the argument that he wasn't actually that high risk because he was fully vaccinated, and the place he was coming from, New Zealand, was a Category 2, generally considered to be a low-risk area. He argued that the 10 hours he spent in London, at London Heathrow and London Gatwick, and in transit between the two, so getting a public coach, was not low risk because the coach itself mandated the wearing of masks and social distancing, and he questioned why that was different to someone from the UK who, for example, lives in London, deciding to come over after spending significantly longer periods of time in what is a Category 4 region. That was debated quite vigorously in court this week. Dr. Brink questioned a lot of his points regarding public health evidence. She pointed out that he could not actually evidence the fact that he was low, or the suggestion that he was low risk, partly because he'd been through 4 international travel hubs, which would have brought him into contact with travellers from not just those regions, but from neighbouring regions who were using those same airports for onwards travel, or from nearby countries or jurisdictions. She said the risk profile essentially was unknown because of that. She did not have evidence of the measures, every single measure that was in place on every plane he boarded, in every departure lounge he was in every travel hub or public transport that he used in order to take that long journey from New Zealand, which of course is not direct, to Guernsey. The cross-examination, I think, was probably quite revealing, because the tone and the way that he presented his arguments in his closing statement were a lot more polished than they were during cross-examination. That'd be my observation. His suggestion that he'd been detained against his will and that his liberty had been deprived was countered by Dr. Nicola Brink and her advocate Penny Grange, on the basis that he'd actually made a choice, and then he'd doubled down on the hope that his variation would be approved, and then advanced public health reasons for which he did not believe that isolation requirements were necessary in his case. His main argument was that the decision to require him to self-isolate was against human rights and the Bailiwick Guernsey human rights law, which dates back to 2000. And there's an article in that which says that the deprivation of liberty can be imposed in order to avoid the transmission or to kind of mitigate against the transmission of infectious diseases. His argument was simply that he did not pose that risk. Therefore, that article of the human rights law was being unlawfully applied. That has been dismissed. The argument that was advanced was that having the provision of a variation in certain compassionate circumstances is in fact adhering to the need to meet that requirement in human rights law, and that has been considered. That was considered in the construction of the law and its application in other circumstances, ones where Dr. Brink, as the statutory officer for health, has deemed it to be kind of proportionate and warranted. That shows that is there, and that in that sense the regulations are lawful in relation to human rights.
And he was aware of all these legal ramifications and the rules that he should have been following. Was he aware of it, and he was just arguing against everything that I guess we've been adhering to?
I think there's a combination of both, and I think the point of view that was presented in court was that he did not know at the time that he booked his travel that he would have to self-isolate for 14 days. He had misunderstood some press releases from the States, and then latterly obviously looked into it in more detail. He had quite a well-advanced view on the regulations themselves, and it's hard to know whether he kind of developed that after the fact as part of his legal challenge, or if those reviews he already held, which were then kind of exacerbated by a mistake, by way of, first of all, kind of a direct appeal to her to consider a variation, and then subsequently, when that was refused, a legal challenge. I think it's significant that a challenge like this has come from someone in a similar field to Dr. Brink, someone who knows that role, and they had reached this stage. The full court hearing, I think, especially when the full judgment is published, will be quite revealing as to what weight has been given to certain aspects, what's been accepted by the judge and what hasn't. I guess to give more of an idea into some of the nuances that we don't know yet from Judge Catherine Fuchs simply saying that the case is dismissed. There's an interesting comment in the States last week, actually, which can be reapplied here, that two people with knowledge of a situation can have a different opinion on the same facts. And that doesn't make either opinion invalid, but it shows that there is a range of opinions, and that evidence or lack of evidence, unknowns, imponderables, of which there are many with regards to this pandemic still, can therefore be interpreted in different ways by people with a professional knowledge of that area. So there is there's a validity to this challenge, but clearly it has been dismissed, and the dismissal is important in the respect that it gives that certainty that the laws were reasonably, lawfully, and with good reason applied by our medical officer for health, Dr. Nicola Brink, in this case. And I guess that breeds a further confidence that it's applied reasonably and logically in every other application for a variation. If the case had been upheld and he'd have won, the legal challenge, it's impossible to ignore the ramifications that would have.
And I want to talk about you because, of course, Dr. Brink has been brought into this, and she's had to spend time in court. I mean, has there been a certain bias because it hasn't been well received by the public? You can tell on social media that people are thinking it's a bit of a waste of time. Is that really the case?
Well, I think the Royal Court judge, especially during the course of these kind of hearings, they do operate in a bubble, kind of outside of kind of public commentary, and it's a real plank of their role is to be thick-skinned, to be immune to kind of coercion. I very much doubt she even spends time looking at any. As a kind of side note, I recently spoke to a defence advocate who I won't name because he said it just kind of to me personally, but he said that he doesn't read any of the comments on any of the stories about clients in which he's represented.
As a very sensible thing to do.
So I wish I could do the same. But
you have to.
Yeah, but the point is, obviously, there is a fine line, as we're understanding more and more, between social media influence and decision making. But I think in this legal context, I don't think that's really kind of punctuated that in a case like this. What I do think is important is that people express their opinions, but also that he is permitted to express his. And there was a case for him to bring based on his interpretation of the situation. He went through all of the correct procedures before going to court, and that he did apply for a variation. When he got here, having been instructed to self-isolate, he did self-isolate. And then whilst in self-isolation, he appealed directly outside of the public realm to Dr. Brink in her statutory role. He has pursued all of the avenues, and then the legal challenges, I guess in his mind, as a last resort.
And he's pursuing it beyond his isolation as well.
Yeah, and he says that he's been motivated to do it partly out of public interest, and then other people he knows who are in this context, and I think perhaps also more generally, a little discontent with some of the isolation requirements for people who are not presenting to be unwell. That's a sentiment that we know exists, and I think he's probably harnessed some of that beyond just his individual circumstances and used that to kind of fuel his legal challenge, which of course was never actually going to affect him in a direct sense, because as we record this on Thursday the 22nd of July, he's in day 13 of his isolation. There was a very firm indication from some of his comments that he would have taken decisions very differently if he was currently the Director of Public Health, which is it's almost it's a completely hypothetical situation because he isn't. But one thing I would say about the challenge itself is I think it's been good, and I don't think the timing of it has been good, but arguably there would never be a good time for something like this in a pandemic for the Director of Public Health. What I think is important, and I think it's not a view that many will perhaps share, especially on social media, particularly Facebook, is that, first of all, throughout the pandemic, Dr. Brink has based all of her decisions on evidence, and she stressed in all of the press briefings and all the statements that she's made that she is evidence-led, that she looks at data, identifies trends, models, or her team, models waves and different circumstances. What happens if you unlock borders or restrictions at a certain rate? What happens if you don't? What's the best and worst case scenarios? All of that. And it's a very scientific approach. So having what is almost a kind of peer review, her reasons for imposing self-isolation requirements had to be tested and scrutinised in the Royal Court.
And upheld.
And that's the crucial point, because no one who has anything to hide should be afraid of scrutiny. And we've seen that in the States recently, that there's been a disturbing trend between about freedom of information, about access, and it always, even if it's not born out of wanting to hide something, it creates the possibility for that to happen unchallenged, and it also kind of foments doubt as to why someone doesn't want that challenge. I think she's embraced the challenge that has come. She has withstood a lot of the criticism, and at times actually quite personal criticism from Dr. Bridgman, which maybe overstepped the mark, and I won't repeat all of it. Her approach has always been empirical, and there's been a real forensic and empirical examination of her decision making over the last 2 or 3 days, and it stood up to the test. So what people should get from this, even if they feel it's a waste of time, even if they're saying that he should pay the court fees, even if they're saying that this was an unnecessary disruption, what they should take from it, which is a positive, is that this is the first real scrutiny of our public health director's decision making in a completely objective legal setting. I mean, this does provide a formal legal demonstration, and ultimately it should be seen as proof that the system is working.
And that I suppose because Dr. Brink has been where the CCA has been taking its decisions from, the decisions are right.
Oh, at least the decisions are founded and reasonable. As I stated earlier, there's always going to be, different interpretations of the same situation or the same facts. And if you just have to look at some of the messaging boards that go around the state's briefings. People, you're pro or you're con, and
once
I think
you're in your camp.
Yeah, and I think we've lost that element of meaningful challenge during the pandemic in a way, because there are people behind the scenes who, believe it or not, given that they're civil servants, they know what they're doing. They are considering strategic matters. They're coming up with a policy that is designed to try and improve the lives for the maximum number of islanders possible in unprecedented circumstances and within resources that, compared to larger nations, are quite small.
And so, if we come back down from all that to finish off with the case itself, what happens next? Is there action to happen next? Because didn't he threatened that if he failed with this, he would continue on a path anyway?
I mean, I wonder what is to be gained by trying to extend the duration of his current appeal. I mean, the CCA was listed as a respondent alongside Dr. Brink, and his arguments around the proportionality of the CCA's regulations themselves were incorporated, and the spirit of that was definitely embodied in his arguments. It's not impossible. I don't think it was possible to decouple his criticism of Dr. Brink from his criticism of the wider regulations and the imposition of self-isolation requirements. Both of those arguments were advanced during the course of the hearing. Again, we haven't seen the full notes, the judge's full notes.
When are those set to be published?
I think there will be a interim judgment, which will have a little bit more detail in the coming days, and then on a later date there will be a full write-up of proceedings from the Royal Court Judge Catherine Fuchs, who was the only one presiding over this case. I think in terms of what it means for the CCA is back to business as usual. For Dr. Bridgman, there's been no...
Back to New Zealand.
It will be back to New Zealand, and I think they will, on their current border policy, they will be requiring for him to self-isolate for 14 days in New Zealand. There's been no indication from him of any further challenge, and I do think that, as mentioned, his criticism of the regulations and their application, in his case, were both advanced during this hearing, so I don't think that they can be advanced any further in this setting. Hypothetically, you could go to the Court of Appeal.
This is a great moment for Dr. Brink, really, because what I take from this is I can't imagine what situation we would be in now if it had been Dr. Stephen Bridgman here instead. Would it be completely different?
That's hard to say, because we're looking at it from a certain point in the pandemic. We are in the harder part, which is the exiting lockdown stage, which is much longer, much more protracted, much more open to interpretation. It's been reiterated throughout that going into lockdown is easy. The rate at which you ease restrictions, there are a range of views in the community about the rate at which restrictions are lifted, about what should come first, where the balance lies, what the strategy should be for the island, and how you manage those difficult exceptions the individual applications, how you manage the subject of liberty and freedom, because one person's liberty could endanger the liberty of others if a risk is allowed to go uncontrolled. And there's a line that stood out to me, and it wasn't actually from Dr. Bridgman, and it wasn't from Dr. Brink. It was from the aforementioned Mark Degari, who said that in the circumstances that we are in, we cannot afford to lose sight of strategic objectives. We cannot obsess, or the state's public health cannot obsess in every single individual application, in every exemption that's put forward. The resources have to go into a system that enables the freedom of most people wherever possible, whilst also allowing for variations to be foremost. And there needs to be a strategy. It can't be scattergun. It can't be one application to the next. Otherwise, the whole system would break down. They would be riddled in indecision. The CCA would not be able to function or respond to situations, to policy planning, and the modelling that has underlied everything over the last 18 months of managing risk, of weighing up what happens if you pull certain levers, what happens if you lock down, what happens if you don't. All of that would be lost, because you'd be focusing solely on the minutiae of individual risk assessments, individual statements, and weighing up circumstances. So I think perhaps the summing up line, which was presented quite persuasively in the hearing, was that every risk that you take for one person, or every risk that public health takes for one person, is a risk that public health takes for the whole island. And on behalf, as the custodian of the public health of the Bailiwick, that's a significant responsibility. And to know that those decisions, or to have another piece of proof that those decisions are being made with good reason behind them, should be seen as a reassuring factor.
Thank you for listening to the Bailiwick Express podcast. The title track was Shift My Weight by Luno. If you enjoyed it, I know it's a pain, but please like and share. It all helps, and remember, you can hit bailiwickexpress.com to stay right up to date with whatever is happening in the Bailiwick. You can find us online, on social, on email, and on internet radio. There'll be more from me, Matthew Leach, and all the Bailiwick Express team next Friday.